First up, signs of hip-hop culture are everywhere, even in Wyoming. From the music and dance styles enjoyed in places like the Buckhorn to the fashion trends and slang we see and hear every day. In short, hip-hop influences have been absorbed by the mainstream and are a multi-billion-dollar global industry, but its origins were by no means glamorous. University of Wyoming professor of African American and Diaspora Studies, Kerry Pimblott, joined us to explain. She will be teaching a course on the socioeconomic conditions that led to the birth of hip-hop. So for starters, I think I ought to throw out that hip-hop is not just music or a dance style, it's, what would you call it, a culture?
Yes, a subculture. I think it's a youth subculture that really emerged in New York City in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in which there were four elements. So you've mentioned two there, which is the rapping or MCing, the dancing or b-boying, and then also DJing, and then the last one is graffiti art. So at the time it consisted of a subculture with four different components.
And these were things that the people living in the inner city communities had at their disposal, things they could do, and they did for recreation and expression.
Yes, I think for recreation, for expression, then also at that time it was also a political critique of the society that they occupied. So the reason I'm really interested in hip-hop in terms of that time period, the late 1970s, early 1980s, is that it kind of articulates a blues narrative of that culture, which was America's going through the experience of deindustrialization. They're losing jobs overseas. Companies are migrating with jobs and capital and plants elsewhere. And people are left in communities like Brooklyn or the South Bronx without very much resources in a state of urban crisis. And so the music is a blues of that period. It kind of comments from the bottom on the kind of costs of deindustrialization. So for me, that's the real fascinating part about it, is it's a response from working class Latino and Black youth in that period.
It started back during the Reagan administration.
That's correct.
And just kind of, and then continued during the Bush years. And there were dynamics going on. And I guess the big one, the new one for me would be a term called neoliberalism. Could you explain what that is and how that affects this?
Absolutely. So neoliberalism is kind of an ideology of our time. It's something that we view as commonsensical today. It's a set of economic and political values that are all over the United States and the globe. The major parts of this is the belief in the freedom of markets, the ability of capital to move overseas without boundaries, labor to move overseas without boundaries, so more immigration for the purposes of serving the workplace, but also the movement of those companies that I described moving overseas without inhibition. And so there's that aspect at the economic level, but also there's a belief at the political level in terms of a US public policy in a small state, meaning a shrinking of the welfare state. The government's job is no longer to provide a safety net. And so in this context, and you see that under Reagan and under Bush, which is a shrinking of the welfare state, but a growth at the same time, ironically, of the punitive state, kind of the prison system or policing. That's where the money is going, not into social welfare programs. So hip-hop, when it emerges in the late 1970s, early 1980s, is dealing both with the economic aspects of neoliberalism, which is this flight of capital, which people are experiencing in terms of job losses and unemployment, but it's also dealing in its social commentary, songs like The Message by Grandmaster Flash, is the impact on communities that have no safety net left, and where policing is the only place where money is going, and increasingly so. And so it's all of the social ramifications of that in terms of poverty, homelessness, the lack of kind of institutional networks, and then also the experience of confrontation with state agents, police, law enforcement, etc. So
you brought up the prison industrial complex, which is the increase in incarceration. Could you explain why it disproportionately affected the Black community?
Yeah, really complex question, but with some key answers I think that people have pointed to. In this class that I'm teaching, we'll be reading Michelle Alexander's great book, New York Times bestseller, The New Jim Crow. And in it, she explores the impact on African American and Latino communities and sees this mass incarceration as a new Jim Crow, right? So it has racialized effects. It segregates people. And so in that context, some of the key things she points to in her book and other scholars have pointed to as well is how law enforcement is practiced in different spaces. And so the disproportionate kind of numbers, and I've seen this in my own work too, of law enforcement in certain urban communities that are predominantly Black and Latino. So the police are there more frequently, even though drug usage or crime, occurs at all levels of society, right? In all social groups, all classes, all races. So heavy policing, and then disparate sentencing is another thing that she points to, particularly as it pertains to the war on drugs. And so those two aspects together create a massive growth, a completely disproportionate growth in the number of African Americans and Latinos being incarcerated in the US, and an overall growth in the policing, in the prison population.
Some of these things, not necessarily the incarceration, but the economic squeeze. Hey, we're all feeling it now. Absolutely. With the 1% concentrating more and more of the income and the wealth. So could this account for why hip-hop is so incredibly popular and why it continues to become more so?
I think so, and actually that's one of the aspects that's most interesting to me today is not even hip-hop in the US, where hip-hop has become increasingly commercialized, and there's a lot of critiques within hip-hop itself about whether the music has stayed true to its roots, as a kind of critique of this structural change in the US economy and state. I think outside of the US, we definitely see hip-hop being used in the ways that it was initially used in places like the South Bronx, which is it's performed by both people of African descent and people of other races who are experiencing these same transformations in different places as a result of globalization, and are using hip-hop as their vehicle to speak back. It becomes the blues of the oppressed, right? It's a way of articulating their critique of society and the transformations we're seeing taking place. So in places like Cuba, for example, hip-hop is extremely popular right now in terms of critiques of the state there in a communist society, right? There are groups that are feminist performers or lesbian and gay performers like Las Crudas who use it as a critique of the communist state. They're using it to challenge them on issues of sexuality and race. So that's been really interesting. We see it in Brazil, the critique of Brazil's kind of making of race invisible, as though race does not matter in Brazil because of the nature of their society ethnically. So hip-hop performers of African descent perform their racial identity through hip-hop there to critique the state. Well, then in the UK, where I'm from, we have garage music, which is an offshoot of hip-hop, and through the 90s and early 2000s, it became a way of people of African descent and white working class youth articulating a critique of neoliberalism in Britain as well. So it's served the same functions, I think, but a little differently in each context.
How do you make a connection with Wyoming students? Because I'm guessing a lot of them have never been to urban areas.
It was surprising. We had the Talib Kweli talk here on campus for Days of Dialogue a few months ago, and I was surprised by how many white Wyoming students were through their questions, obviously had a knowledge of hip-hop and were very interested in his music and the music of Black Star and others. So it showed what you just said, which is that even though hip-hop reflected initially a subculture that did not include Wyoming, right? It has grown through the marketplace to kind of attract the attention of populations for reasons that are very complex outside of its original community. And so in that sense, I think students in Wyoming have showed a great interest in this course. I've had more contact about this class on hip-hop than any class I've offered before, and that's surprising to me, and I'm still trying to figure out why. Is some of it cultural tourism? That's a question. Is it some way of kind of engaging in a culture that is not your own? Or is there something in the message of the music that resonates with a Wyoming working class student experience? And that's a curiosity that I want to kind of satisfy through teaching the class, is what is it that attracts students from Wyoming to this genre?
What do you want them to take away from the class?
Most importantly, I think hip-hop for me is just a lens to understand and a cultural artifact of our moment. It's the blues of our moment. In the class, I talk about our historical moment from 1974 to the present as being a new nadir or new low point in African-American history. And the original nadir was the late 19th, early 20th century, a period that we associate with Jim Crow segregation, political disenfranchisement of African-Americans through poll taxes and literacy tests, and scholars have made parallels between that moment, which we view as the lowest point in the Black experience since emancipation, and our own moment. So for me, it's getting students to challenge their idea of racial kind of colorblindness, that we live in a post-racial society in which issues of racism have been fully addressed. I think hip-hop is a great vehicle to articulate that that is not the case. In hip-hop, race is extremely salient, class is extremely salient, and so it's a vehicle for me to kind of challenge some of their underlying assumptions about where we are as a nation today and the responsibility of us as citizens.
Dr. Kerry Pimblott, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.